Working on the pyramids of ancient Egypt meant stepping into one of the most ambitious building projects in human history. Today, the pyramids appear silent and timeless, rising above the desert as if they had always been there. Yet thousands of ordinary people once filled the area with noise, dust, conversation, and constant activity. For the men who participated in their construction, the pyramids were not mysterious monuments. They were a workplace, a duty, and sometimes even an opportunity. To imagine the life of a pyramid worker, it helps to picture the Nile Valley during the height of Egypt's Old Kingdom more than 4,000 years ago. The land along the Nile was fertile, producing grain, vegetables, and livestock that supported a growing population. Each year, the river flooded the fields, leaving behind rich soil that farmers relied on. But during the flood season, when the water covered the farmland, agricultural work temporarily stopped. This pause in farming created an unusual situation. Thousands of strong laborers suddenly had time when they could not work their fields. The Egyptian state used this time to organize large construction projects. Pyramid building was one of the most important of them. Workers were recruited from villages along the Nile and transported to building sites such as Giza, Saqqara, or Dashur. Instead of being prisoners forced into labor, many of them were farmers performing seasonal service for the state. In return, they received food, clothing, shelter, and in some cases, social prestige. Arriving at a pyramid construction site must have been overwhelming. The landscape was crowded with activity. Teams of men hauled blocks on wooden sledges across prepared roads. Stonemasons hammered away with copper tools and dolerite pounding stones. Overseers shouted instructions, while scribes recorded deliveries of materials. Dust hung in the air, and the sound of stone striking stone echoed across the desert plateau. Workers did not simply wander in and start lifting stones. The labor force was carefully organized into crews and smaller groups. Each team had its own identity and sometimes even its own name. Archaeologists have discovered graffiti left by workers inside the pyramids that reveal these crew names. Some groups called themselves things like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a sense of humor and camaraderie among the laborers. These crews worked in shifts, rotating through different tasks. One group might drag limestone blocks from the quarry, while another shaped stones so that they would fit precisely into the growing structure. Others transported tools, prepared ropes, or constructed ramps used to move heavy materials up the pyramid's rising sides. The daily routine of a worker began early. The desert air before sunrise was cooler, making it easier to begin physically demanding work. Laborers gathered with their crews and received instructions for the day. Tools were distributed, sledges were prepared, and teams lined up to begin hauling stone. Moving the massive limestone blocks required coordination rather than brute strength alone. Workers pulled sledges using thick ropes, sometimes pouring water on the sand in front of the sled to reduce friction. Archaeological discoveries and wall paintings suggest that dozens of men could pull a single block together, chanting rhythmically to maintain coordination. Although the work was demanding, it was not as chaotic as one might imagine. Organization was the key to constructing something as enormous as a pyramid. Supervisors monitored progress, while scribes kept records of labor, materials, and rations. Ancient Egypt was a highly bureaucratic society, and pyramid construction reflected that administrative skill. One of the most surprising discoveries made by archaeologists in recent decades was the workers' village near the pyramids of Giza. Excavations revealed housing complexes where laborers lived while working on the monuments. These were not crude temporary camps, but planned communities with sleeping areas, bakeries, kitchens, and storage facilities. The presence of bakeries and breweries was especially important. Bread and beer formed the foundation of the workers' diet. Bread provided calories needed for heavy labor, while beer was a safer alternative to untreated water and also supplied nutrients. Workers likely received daily rations of both. Animal bones discovered in the workers' village reveal another interesting detail. The laborers ate meat regularly. Archaeologists have found remains of cattle, sheep, and goats,
indicating that the workforce was well supplied with protein. Feeding thousands of people required a massive logistical effort, suggesting that the Egyptian state invested significant resources in maintaining the workforce. Life in the workers' settlement probably felt like living in a busy industrial town. Smoke rose from ovens where bread was baked continuously. Teams of cooks prepared large quantities of food. Craftsmen repaired tools. Medical workers treated injuries. Everywhere, people moved with purpose, contributing to the enormous task unfolding nearby. Despite the scale of the operation, pyramid workers were still individuals with personal stories. Some were experienced craftsmen who specialized in stone cutting or engineering. Others were farmers temporarily serving the state. Young men might view the work as an adventure, while older laborers might see it as a duty tied to their loyalty to the pharaoh. Religion also played an important role in shaping how workers understood their labor. In ancient Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He was seen as a divine figure connected to the gods and responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Building the pharaoh's tomb was therefore not simply construction work, it was part of a sacred mission.
The afterlife. Participating in the construction of a pyramid could be interpreted as contributing to the eternal journey of the king and the prosperity of the entire kingdom. Even so, the work was physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Lifting heavy stone blocks, working with primitive tools, and navigating steep ramps exposed laborers to injury. Archaeological studies of skeletons from workers' cemeteries show signs of healed fractures, worn joints, and other physical stress associated with intense labor. However, the same cemeteries reveal something equally important. The workers were buried with respect. Many were interred near the pyramids they helped construct, often with simple grave goods. This suggests that they were valued members of society rather than disposable slaves. The presence of medical care at the workers' village also indicates that injured laborers received treatment. Archaeologists have discovered skeletal remains showing evidence of healed bones that must have required assistance and time to recover. This implies that the workforce had access to some level of health care. The tools used by pyramid builders were surprisingly simple compared to modern construction equipment. Copper chisels, wooden mallets, stone hammers, and basic measuring instruments formed the core of their toolkit. Yet skilled craftsmen could achieve remarkable precision with these tools. Stone cutters shaped blocks so that they fit together tightly without mortar. Surveyors used measuring ropes and sighting instruments to ensure that the pyramid's sides were aligned with extraordinary accuracy. Even today, the pyramid's orientation toward the cardinal directions is astonishingly precise. Transporting materials from quarries to construction sites was another massive challenge. Limestone, used for the core of many pyramids, came from nearby quarries, while finer limestone for outer casing often came from quarries across the Nile. Granite, used in interior chambers, traveled from Aswan hundreds of kilometers away. Boats carried these heavy stones along the Nile during the flood season. Once the materials reached the construction site, teams of workers dragged them across prepared pathways to the pyramid itself. Every stage of the journey required careful coordination. As the pyramid rose higher, new challenges appeared. Ramps built from mud brick and stone allowed workers to move blocks upward. Historians still debate the exact design of these ramps, but they were essential for raising materials as the structure grew taller. Working high on the pyramid must have been both exhilarating and terrifying. From those heights, workers could see the Nile stretching across the landscape and the desert extending beyond it. At the same time, a misstep could lead to a dangerous fall. Workers may have believed that their efforts helped secure stability in both the earthly world and the afterlife. Despite these risks, the pyramids continued to grow year after year. Construction could last decades, meaning that some workers might spend a large portion of their adult lives participating in the project. Others might only serve temporarily before returning to their villages. Life outside work hours likely involved rest, conversation, and community. Workers shared meals, told stories, and built friendships within their crews. The names discovered in graffiti suggest that these teams developed strong identities and perhaps even friendly rivalries. Festivals and religious ceremonies may also have played a role in maintaining morale. Ancient Egyptian society was deeply connected to ritual and celebration. Workers might participate in ceremonies honoring the pharaoh or the gods, reinforcing the spiritual meaning of their labor. Over time, the pyramid slowly took its final shape. Once the main structure was completed, craftsmen installed smooth outer casing stones that made the pyramid gleam brilliantly in sunlight. In its finished form, the monument would have looked dramatically different from the weathered stone structures we see today. For the workers who helped build it, seeing the completed pyramid must have been a powerful moment. Their labor had transformed a barren desert plateau into one of the most remarkable structures ever created. Eventually, the construction teams disbanded. Seasonal workers returned to farming along the Nile. Skilled craftsmen moved on to other royal building projects, such as temples, tombs, or statues. The workers' village gradually emptied as the massive project reached completion. Yet the pyramids remained, towering above the landscape long after the people who built them were gone. Generations passed, empires rose and fell, and still the pyramids stood as silent witnesses to ancient ambition. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover traces of the people behind these monuments. Pottery fragments, tool marks, graffiti, and human remains all help reconstruct the lives of the workers. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding of how these extraordinary structures came into existence. The story that emerges is not one of faceless slaves suffering under endless punishment. Instead, it reveals a vast, organized workforce composed of farmers, artisans, administrators, and laborers. Their efforts were coordinated by one of the most sophisticated states of the ancient world. Being a pyramid worker meant participating in something far larger than oneself. It required endurance, cooperation, and skill. It involved living in a bustling community dedicated to a monumental task. And for many, it may have carried a sense of purpose tied to religion, loyalty, and national pride.
Age. They represent the combined effort of thousands of individuals whose daily labor transformed raw stone into enduring monuments. When visitors stand before the pyramids now, it is easy to focus only on the pharaohs whose tombs they were meant to protect. Yet the real story also belongs to the workers whose hands shaped each block, whose footsteps crossed the desert plateau, and whose lives briefly intersected with one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. The sun did not rise gently over the Giza Plateau. It burst over the horizon like a furnace opening, pouring heat across the pale desert stones. Long before that moment, however, movement had already begun among the clusters of mud brick buildings where the workers slept. Shadows moved through narrow corridors, sandals scraped against packed earth floors, and the first voices of the day cut through the cool morning air. Someone carried baskets of barley toward a bakery. Another man poured water into a large clay mixing trough. The smell of damp grain soon blended with smoke from ovens that had been lit while the sky was still black. For the laborers who lived in this settlement, the day's rhythm started early and rarely changed. Bread needed to be baked before the hauling crews assembled. Tools had to be collected, ropes inspected, sledges repaired. The pyramid itself might have been the center of the entire enterprise, yet the life supporting it stretched far beyond the stone slopes rising in the distance. Inside one of the sleeping rooms, men rolled up their linen blankets. Some spoke quietly, others remained silent, saving energy for the hours ahead. Their hands already showed signs of the work that defined their lives, calluses thick as leather,
knuckles swollen from gripping rope and stone. Most of them had arrived from villages scattered along the Nile. During months when farmland lay underwater from the annual flood, the government summoned workers to join state projects. Pyramid construction was the most demanding of all. Leaving the housing compounds, the men stepped into the open air, where a faint blue line of light was forming along the eastern horizon. In the distance, the pyramid dominated everything. Even in half-darkness, it appeared enormous, its rising sides cutting a sharp triangle against the sky. Each day, more stone joined the structure, pushing it gradually higher. Teams gathered in open courtyards while supervisors walked among them. Some workers carried copper chisels wrapped in cloth to protect their edges. Others shouldered wooden levers or bundles of rope. The hauling groups were easy to identify. Their ropes were thick and heavy, and their shoulders bore dark marks where the fibers rubbed against skin during long pulls. A scribe sat on a low stool with a wooden writing board resting across his knees. He dipped a reed pen into ink and recorded the arrival of each crew. Administrative order mattered enormously in a project involving thousands of people. Without records, who worked, how much grain had been distributed, how many blocks arrived from the quarry, the operation could easily descend into chaos. Breakfast was simple but filling. Workers received loaves of coarse bread and jars of beer made from fermented grain. The drink was not especially strong, but it provided calories and nutrients necessary for physically exhausting tasks. Clay cups passed from hand to hand, while conversations drifted across the courtyard. Some men joked with one another. Others stared silently toward the pyramid, as if measuring the work ahead. When the sun finally appeared above the horizon, the settlement erupted into motion. Crews moved toward the construction site in long lines. Dust rose beneath their feet. The pyramid loomed closer with every step, revealing ramps, scaffoldings, and clusters of workers already climbing its sides. At ground level, enormous limestone blocks waited on wooden sledges. Each block weighed several tons. Hauling them required precise coordination among dozens of men. The rope teams arranged themselves in rows, gripping thick fibers that stretched forward from the sledge's front edge. An overseer raised his arm. The first pull always required the greatest effort. Muscles tightened, bodies leaned forward, and the rope snapped taut. For a moment, the stone refused to move. Then the sledge lurched, grinding against the prepared pathway beneath it. A collective shout erupted from the crew as the block began sliding across the sand. Movement had to remain steady. If the rope teams lost rhythm, the sledge might jerk or stall. To prevent that, some workers chanted in unison, creating a rough cadence that guided each step. Others poured water onto the sand ahead of the runners. Moistening the surface reduced friction, allowing the massive weight to glide more easily. The path leading toward the pyramid was crowded with activity. Stonecutters chipped away at newly delivered blocks, shaping them with copper tools and pounding stones. Carpenters repaired broken sledges using wooden pegs and leather bindings. Donkey handlers guided animals carrying baskets of rubble away from the construction zone. Higher on the pyramid, a completely different world unfolded. Narrow ramps zigzagged across the growing structure. Men balanced carefully while pushing blocks upward using wooden rollers and levers. The higher they climbed, the stronger the wind became, carrying fine sand that scratched against skin and eyes. The pyramids continue to inspire awe today, but their true significance lies not only in their size or precision. Surveyors stood near the edges, holding measuring rods and sighting tools. Precision was essential. Even a small deviation at the base could cause serious alignment problems higher up. These specialists ensured that each new course of stones remained perfectly positioned. From a distance, the construction site resembled an enormous living machine.
Every group had its role, every action connected to another. Hauling teams delivered blocks, masons refined them, engineers guided placement, and scribes documented progress. The system relied on cooperation across hundreds of small tasks. Yet the workers themselves did not think of their efforts as mechanical. For them, relationships within each crew were deeply personal. Teams developed identities that strengthened loyalty and morale. Graffiti discovered inside pyramids reveals names painted proudly on stone surfaces by the workers themselves. Some groups used playful titles that hinted at humor among the labor force. Those inscriptions were not official markings carved by royal artisans. They were casual brushstrokes left by men who wanted their presence remembered, even if only within the hidden chambers of a monument built for a king. Life inside the workers' settlement reflected similar bonds. After hours of hauling stone and shaping blocks, laborers returned to their quarters exhausted. The evening air cooled quickly once the sun disappeared, bringing relief from the relentless heat of the day. Cooking fires flickered outside the housing compounds. Pots simmered with lentils or vegetables, while bread from communal ovens circulated among groups of friends. Some workers received portions of meat, especially after large livestock deliveries arrived to feed the workforce. Conversations often drifted toward home villages along the Nile. Many men had families waiting there, wives tending fields, children helping with livestock, elders maintaining household traditions. The pyramid site was a temporary world, intense and demanding, but not permanent. Evenings sometimes included music. Simple instruments such as flutes or hand drums appeared during gatherings. Songs echoed across the settlement while stars emerged above the desert. In those moments, the monumental pyramid nearby might fade from immediate attention, replaced by the ordinary pleasures of companionship. Illness and injury, however, were unavoidable realities. Lifting heavy loads and working with stone tools inevitably caused accidents. Some workers developed strained muscles or cracked bones. Others suffered cuts that could become infected in the dusty environment. Archaeological discoveries show that medical treatment existed within the workers' community. Evidence of healed fractures suggests injured individuals received care rather than being abandoned. Ancient Egyptian medicine combined practical knowledge with spiritual beliefs, involving bandaging techniques as well as rituals intended to restore balance to the body.
Not every worker performed brute labor. Skilled artisans occupied respected positions within the workforce. Stone carvers, responsible for shaping interior chambers, required years of training. Their tools had to be handled with delicate precision, especially when working with harder materials such as granite. Transporting granite from quarries far south along the Nile represented another logistical challenge. Massive blocks traveled by boat during high water seasons. Once they arrived near the pyramid complex, specialized crews handled their movement across land. These operations demanded planning that extended far beyond the construction site itself. Agricultural production, river transport, quarry management, and administrative record-keeping all supported the building effort. The pyramid became the visible symbol of an enormous national network. Religion shaped much of the thinking behind this system. In Egyptian belief, the king maintained harmony between the human world and the divine realm. Ensuring his safe passage into the afterlife was considered essential for preserving cosmic order. Constructing his burial monument, therefore, carried spiritual significance. Workers may have viewed their labor through that lens. Contributing to the king's eternal resting place meant participating in something sacred. Even individuals performing the most exhausting tasks might have felt connected to a broader purpose, linking Earth, gods, and the future of the kingdom. Days turned into months. Months gradually became years. The pyramid rose course by course, transforming the skyline of the plateau. Ramps lengthened, scaffolding expanded, and new sections of polished casing stone appeared near the upper levels. Those outer stones were particularly striking. Cut from fine white limestone, they reflected sunlight so intensely that the finished pyramid would have shone like a brilliant geometric beacon visible from many kilometers away. Travelers approaching the Nile Valley might have seen the monument glittering above the horizon. For the men who hauled the blocks and fitted them into place, watching the structure evolve must have been a strange experience. Every completed layer represented thousands of individual actions, pulls of rope, hammer strikes, measurements carefully taken. Some workers remained involved for many seasons. Others rotated back to their villages after fulfilling their service period. Fresh crews replaced them, continuing the effort without interruption. This cycle allowed agriculture along the Nile to continue while still supplying manpower for monumental construction. Children growing up in nearby regions might have visited the plateau with their families, staring in amazement at the rising pyramid. Perhaps some imagined joining the workforce when they reached adulthood. The monument was not merely a tomb under construction, it was the defining project of an entire generation. Eventually, the day arrived when the final stones were set into place. The ramps that had once carried blocks upward were dismantled. Remaining debris was cleared away, revealing the smooth geometry of the completed pyramid. The structure dominated the desert landscape with an authority that must have seemed almost supernatural. Perfectly angled sides met at a single point high above the plateau. Beneath that summit lay corridors, chambers, and passages hidden within the stone mass. Ceremonies likely accompanied the completion of such a monumental project. Priests performed rituals intended to transform the pyramid into a sacred gateway for the king's spirit. Offerings were presented, incense burned, and prayers spoken in ancient words carried by desert winds. For the workers who had spent years shaping the monument, that moment represented the conclusion of a demanding chapter of their lives. Many would soon return to villages along the Nile, carrying stories about the immense structure they had helped create. Over time, new projects would emerge. Other kings commissioned pyramids or temples, drawing laborers back into the cycle of construction. Yet each monument had its own character, shaped by the specific crews who built it. Centuries later, sand drifted across the plateau, covering parts of the workers' settlement. Houses collapsed, ovens filled with debris, and the sounds of daily life vanished. The pyramids endured, but the community that once surrounded them gradually faded from memory. Modern archaeology has begun recovering those lost details. Excavations reveal streets where workers walked, bakeries where thousands of loaves were prepared, and storage rooms where grain once piled high. Even discarded pottery fragments carry traces of the people who lived there. Through these discoveries, a more human portrait of pyramid construction emerges. The monuments were not created by nameless masses under endless punishment. They were built by communities, men who laughed, argued, rested after exhausting shifts, and took pride in accomplishments visible from miles away. The pyramids themselves continue to dominate photographs and documentaries, but their deeper story belongs equally to the thousands whose effort made them possible. Their footsteps once covered the desert paths around those colossal structures, leaving behind faint traces that archaeologists still follow today. And somewhere in the hidden chambers of stone, the painted names of ancient work crews remain. Quiet reminders that behind every massive block stood human hands, human voices, and lives briefly intertwined with one of the greatest construction achievements the world has ever known. Dust often arrived before the workers themselves. A dry wind could sweep across the plateau during the night, coating everything with a thin layer of pale powder. By the time the labor crews stepped outside in the morning, the ground already looked newly painted by the desert. Sand gathered in the folds of clothing, clung to hair, and slipped into the creases of tools. Living beside a pyramid construction site meant accepting that the environment itself was always part of the job. Some men began their day far from the hauling paths or the rising stone structure. In the quarry areas, groups of specialists attacked the bedrock using heavy pounding stones made from extremely hard rock. The work was rhythmic but relentless. Each strike created a sharp cracking sound that echoed between stone faces. Gradually, shallow trenches appeared in the limestone surface, marking the outline of blocks that would eventually be detached. Separating a block from the quarry wall required patience rather than sudden force. Workers inserted wooden wedges into narrow gaps and poured water over them. As the wood expanded, pressure built inside the cracks until the stone finally split along the prepared lines. When the separation occurred, the sound carried across the quarry like distant thunder. Once freed, the blocks still needed shaping. Rough edges were trimmed, surfaces flattened, and corners squared. The aim was not to achieve perfect smoothness immediately. That stage came later when masons refined the stones near the pyramid itself. In the quarry, the goal was efficiency. Every piece of limestone had to be prepared quickly enough to maintain a steady supply for the transport crews waiting nearby. Elsewhere along the plateau, another type of work unfolded, quieter but equally essential. Rope makers twisted long strands of plant fiber into thick cords, strong enough to endure enormous strain. These ropes formed the connection between human muscle and multi-ton blocks of stone. A weak rope could snap under pressure, potentially causing accidents or delaying progress. Carpenters also played a critical role. Wooden sledges required constant maintenance because the friction of dragging heavy loads gradually damaged their runners. Without repair, the sledges would splinter or collapse entirely. Using simple tools, craftsmen replaced broken parts and reinforced joints with wooden pegs. Nearby, storage yards filled with raw materials collected for future stages of construction. Stacks of limestone waited in organized rows. Bundles of reeds used for ropes leaned against mud brick walls. Large jars held grain intended for the bakeries that fed the workforce. Food production was an operation on its own scale. Baking facilities near the workers' settlement operated continuously. Clay molds shaped loaves of bread that were placed inside circular ovens heated by burning straw or wood. The air around these ovens carried a constant aroma of grain and smoke. Beer production required its own process. Grain was soaked, partially baked, and then mixed with water to ferment inside large ceramic jars. Workers depended on this drink for both hydration and nutrition. In the intense heat of Egypt's climate, maintaining energy was vital for anyone performing heavy physical tasks. While these daily activities unfolded, the pyramid itself slowly expanded upward. From afar, the structure resembled a massive staircase made of stone layers stacked one upon another. At certain angles, sunlight reflected off newly placed casing blocks, creating bright flashes visible across the desert. Climbing the pyramid during construction was an experience few modern people can fully imagine. Ramps curved around the sides, sometimes narrow and steep. Workers pushing sledges uphill relied on levers and rollers while carefully balancing their footing. Every movement required concentration. At higher levels, the wind behaved differently than at ground level. Gusts moved freely across the plateau, sometimes strong enough to push loose sand against faces and clothing. Workers had to shield their eyes or wrap cloth around their heads to protect themselves. Surveyors occasionally paused to check alignment using cords stretched between fixed points. These measurements ensured that each side of the pyramid maintained its intended angle. Precision mattered because the monument's final shape depended on consistency across thousands of stones. The building site did not remain silent except for the sound of tools. Voices carried everywhere. Instructions, warnings, jokes, complaints, all mingled with the constant rhythm of labor. Communication was essential for coordinating teams pulling in unison or guiding a block into its precise position. During short breaks, workers sometimes sat in the shadow cast by unfinished sections of the pyramid. Shade in the desert was precious. A small patch of cool ground beneath stone walls offered a brief escape from the relentless sunlight.
Some individuals used these moments to stretch aching muscles. Others inspected their tools, sharpening copper edges against stone surfaces. Conversations ranged from practical matters to stories about distant villages along the Nile. Occasionally, a caravan of supply boats arrived at nearby docks along the river. These vessels carried materials that could not be obtained locally, including fine limestone from quarries across the Nile or granite transported from regions far to the south. When shipments arrived, transport crews immediately prepared to unload the cargo. Large stones moved from boats onto sledges using ramps and wooden rollers. The process required careful balance because a shifting block could crush anyone standing too close. Experienced supervisors guided each step, ensuring that ropes remained secure and paths remained clear. Meanwhile, life inside the workers' settlement continued according to its own rhythm. Children occasionally appeared in the area when families visited laborers stationed there for long periods. Although the settlement functioned primarily as a workplace community, traces of ordinary domestic life existed within its walls.
Pottery fragments discovered by archaeologists suggest that meals sometimes included stews cooked with vegetables or small pieces of meat. Large storage jars preserved supplies for extended periods, allowing cooks to feed hundreds of workers daily. Evenings often brought a shift in mood across the settlement. Once the sun dipped toward the horizon, the intense brightness of the desert softened. Colors changed gradually from white and gold to deep orange and purple. Workers finishing their shifts returned slowly from the construction zone, leaving behind the noise of tools striking stone. Some men washed dust from their arms and faces using water carried from nearby wells. Others collapsed onto benches or low walls, resting tired legs. The sensation of fatigue was familiar to anyone involved in the project. Yet exhaustion did not necessarily bring silence. Groups gathered around fires or outside communal kitchens, exchanging stories and laughter. Rival crews sometimes teased one another about which team had moved more stones that day. Friendly competition added a sense of identity to each group. Religious belief remained woven through many aspects of daily life. Small shrines dedicated to protective deities appeared within the settlement. Workers occasionally left offerings, such as bread or flowers, hoping for safety and good fortune during their labor. Priests associated with the royal building complex also visited the site. Their presence reminded everyone that the pyramid served a sacred purpose. Rituals performed near the construction area symbolically linked the work of human hands with the will of the gods. Injuries still occurred despite careful supervision. When accidents happened, injured workers were carried back to the settlement where healers attempted treatment using herbal remedies and bandages. Some individuals recovered fully and returned to work. Others remained permanently affected by their injuries. Archaeological studies of skeletons buried near pyramid complexes reveal evidence of arthritis and spinal stress, indicating that many laborers endured long-term physical strain. Nevertheless, the same burials also demonstrate that these individuals received respectful treatment after death, often placed in tombs not far from the monuments they helped build. As seasons passed, the pyramid gradually approached completion. The final stages required particularly skilled craftsmen. Polishing the outer casing stones demanded precision because the smooth surfaces needed to align perfectly with one another. When sunlight struck these finished stones, the pyramid must have appeared dazzlingly bright, far different from the weathered surfaces seen today. The monument's geometry transformed sunlight into shimmering reflections visible across the valley. At that stage, the ramps used for construction were slowly dismantled. Workers removed mud brick and debris that had accumulated during decades of labor. What remained was a structure rising cleanly from the desert floor, its shape uninterrupted by scaffolding or temporary pathways. For many laborers, the moment carried mixed emotions. Pride in the accomplishment mingled with anticipation of returning home. Years spent working on the plateau had created friendships and memories that would not easily fade. Some individuals likely returned to farming villages along the Nile, bringing with them stories about the colossal monument now standing in the desert. Others remained within the royal construction system, joining crews assigned to future building projects. The plateau itself gradually quieted. Without the daily arrival of hauling teams and toolmakers, the settlement's busy streets became less crowded. Storage yards emptied, bakeries produced fewer loaves, and the echo of hammer strikes faded. Wind once again became the dominant sound across the landscape. Sand drifted over abandoned pathways where sledges had once passed repeatedly. The pyramid remained unmoved, its vast stone body absorbing the changing colors of sunrise and sunset. Generations later, travelers approaching the region would encounter the monument without fully understanding the enormous human effort behind it. To them, the pyramid might appear almost supernatural, as though it had emerged from the desert through forces beyond ordinary labor. Yet hidden evidence survived. Tool marks on stone blocks, faint graffiti inside chambers, fragments of pottery scattered across the plateau. These traces formed a quiet record of the people whose work shaped the monument. Modern excavations continue uncovering details about those individuals. Streets once walked by laborers have reappeared beneath layers of sand. Remains of bakeries and workshops reveal how an entire community operated beside the construction site. Through these discoveries, historians now understand that pyramid building involved more than raw strength. It required organization, craftsmanship, supply networks, and social cooperation on a remarkable scale. Every limestone block placed in the pyramid represented a chain of actions stretching from quarry to river to construction ramp. Behind each step stood human decisions, human effort, and countless ordinary moments lived by workers whose names rarely entered official records. Those men did not leave behind written memoirs describing their experiences. What survives instead are fragments, marks scratched onto stone, tools worn by repeated use, bones carrying the imprint of long years of labor. From those pieces, a portrait gradually forms. It shows a workforce composed of farmers temporarily serving the state, skilled artisans shaping stone with care, cooks feeding entire crews, and administrators tracking every detail. The pyramid, immense as it is, becomes almost secondary within that broader story. The true achievement lies in the collective action of thousands of individuals coordinating their work toward a single goal. Somewhere long ago, after the last stone was placed and the final ceremonies ended, a worker likely stood at the edge of the plateau and looked back at the finished structure. Perhaps he felt astonishment that something so vast had grown from years of daily effort. Then he turned away and began the journey home along the Nile, leaving the silent monument behind him while carrying memories that no inscription ever recorded. Night on the plateau did not always bring silence. Even after the hauling stopped and the last tools were set aside, faint activity lingered around the edges of the workers' settlement. A few ovens still glowed red from the heat of baking fires. Guards moved slowly between storage yards, watching over piles of materials that would be needed again at sunrise. Somewhere in the darkness, a donkey brayed, its voice echoing briefly against unfinished stone walls. The desert sky above Egypt during that era must have looked astonishingly clear. Without modern lights or smoke-filled air, the stars stretched from horizon to horizon. For many laborers resting after an exhausting shift, that sky might have been the only reminder of the quiet life they once knew along the riverbanks. Sleeping spaces inside the settlement were simple but carefully arranged. Mud brick rooms held narrow sleeping platforms where men laid out woven mats or folded linen cloth. Dozens of workers sometimes shared the same building, forming groups that lived together throughout the entire construction season. These living arrangements created strong bonds between people who depended on one another every day. When someone snored loudly or talked in their sleep, others laughed about it the next morning. Small habits became familiar quickly in such close quarters. One worker might wake earlier than everyone else and step outside before dawn. Another might always complain about sore shoulders after hauling ropes all day. Over time, these personalities formed the social fabric of the workforce. Not every person at the site was a laborer pulling stone blocks. The population included scribes, planners, engineers, and supervisors responsible for organizing thousands of tasks. Without this layer of coordination, the pyramid would never have risen beyond a few scattered courses of stone. Administrative work required its own specialized skills. Scribes were trained in writing systems that used ink and reed pens on papyrus or wooden boards. They tracked how many workers belonged to each crew, how much grain was distributed for food, and how many blocks arrived from different quarries. These records helped the royal government manage resources across the kingdom. During particularly busy periods, the construction zone might resemble a moving landscape of stone. Long lines of sledges approached from different directions, each carrying freshly cut blocks. Crews shouted instructions while adjusting ropes or shifting the angle of a heavy load. Supervisors watched closely, ensuring that the flow of materials remained steady. Some stones destined for internal chambers required more delicate treatment than ordinary building blocks. Granite used inside certain pyramids was far harder than limestone and demanded different techniques for shaping. Craftsmen worked slowly, chipping away at surfaces using tools designed to withstand intense force. These granite pieces often served structural or ceremonial roles within the pyramid's interior. Passages, burial chambers, and protective barriers relied on their strength. Transporting them across hundreds of kilometers from southern Egypt represented one of the most complicated parts of the entire operation. Boats carrying these stones traveled north along the Nile during periods of high water. Once they reached the vicinity of the construction site, unloading became an event involving many workers. Ramps connected riverbanks to storage yards, where the stones waited until crews were ready to move them onto the plateau. The Nile itself played a central role in supporting pyramid construction. Beyond transporting materials, it provided food for the workforce through fishing and irrigation for agriculture. Villages along the river produced grain that eventually reached the bakeries feeding laborers. Many workers maintained strong emotional connections to those villages. Letters did not exist in the modern sense for most people, yet news still traveled through merchants, traveling priests, or seasonal visitors. Stories about births, harvests, or local disputes might reach the settlement weeks or months after the events occurred. Occasionally, someone returned home temporarily during breaks in the construction schedule. These visits allowed workers to check on their families and fields before returning to the plateau when the next labor season began. Weather influenced daily routines more than modern observers might expect. Although Egypt is often imagined as endlessly sunny, the desert environment could produce sudden windstorms. When powerful gusts swept across the plateau, visibility dropped and loose sand filled the air. Under such conditions, hauling heavy stones became extremely difficult. Supervisors sometimes paused operations until the storm weakened. Workers used the unexpected downtime to repair tools, reinforce ropes, or simply rest inside sheltering structures. Once the wind passed, activity resumed almost immediately. Seasonal temperature shifts also mattered. Midday heat during the hottest months could become overwhelming. To reduce strain, some tasks were scheduled earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon when conditions were less extreme. Despite these adjustments, fatigue accumulated over time. Muscles hardened from constant strain, and many workers developed thick calluses on their hands and shoulders. The repetitive motion of pulling ropes or hammering stone gradually reshaped the body itself. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show clear signs of these physical demands. Bones reveal patterns of stress where ligaments repeatedly pulled against them, yet the same remains often show evidence of healing injuries, suggesting that workers received care and support from their community. Burial sites near pyramid complexes provide valuable insights into how laborers were regarded in ancient Egyptian society. Rather than being discarded anonymously, many individuals were interred in small tombs within sight of the monuments they helped build. Simple offerings accompanied their remains. These burials indicate a level of respect that contradicts older theories portraying pyramid builders as enslaved populations. While the work was undeniably strenuous, the archaeological record suggests a workforce integrated into the broader social system of the kingdom. Cultural beliefs surrounding the afterlife may have reinforced that respect. Egyptians believed that proper burial allowed a person's spirit to continue existing beyond death. Even modest tombs fulfilled this spiritual requirement, ensuring that workers shared in traditions normally associated with the wider population. Back at the construction site, progress on the pyramid advanced steadily year after year. Engineers refined ramp systems as the structure grew taller. Some ramps curved around the pyramid's exterior, while others extended directly from the ground toward upper levels. Historians still debate exactly which designs were used, but all required enormous amounts of material and labor. Every time a ramp reached a higher level, crews adjusted their methods for moving blocks. Levers helped raise stones into final position. Wooden rollers occasionally supported sledges during steep climbs. Workers coordinated their movements carefully to prevent accidents. Experienced supervisors watched closely, ready to intervene whenever problems arose. Meanwhile, the pyramid's interior spaces slowly took shape. Narrow corridors extended deep within the structure, connecting chambers designed for burial rituals and protective mechanisms. These hidden areas demanded careful craftsmanship because once sealed, they would remain untouched for centuries. The artisans responsible for carving interior passages worked in dim light provided by oil lamps. Their tools left fine marks on stone surfaces, evidence that archaeologists still study today. Within these quiet chambers, the atmosphere must have felt very different from the bustling activity outside. Workers assigned to interior tasks sometimes painted small inscriptions on hidden blocks, marking which crew had placed them there. These graffiti lines appear casual and playful compared with formal royal hieroglyphs. They reveal glimpses of humor and pride among the labor force. Names referencing strength, loyalty, or good fortune appear frequently. Such titles probably boosted morale while also allowing teams to distinguish their contributions from those of neighboring crews. Over decades, the pyramid gradually approached its final dimensions. The topmost levels required smaller stones and increasingly precise placement. As the summit neared completion, the structure's geometry became unmistakably clear from every direction across the plateau. People traveling along the Nile could see the monument rising above the desert long before reaching the area itself. Sunlight striking its polished casing blocks created a gleam that stood out sharply against the surrounding landscape. For workers who had spent years participating in its construction, that site must have carried special meaning. They understood the effort hidden inside each layer of stone because their own muscles had contributed to the process. Eventually, only the uppermost stones remained to be placed. Lifting those final pieces required careful coordination between crews positioned on narrow platforms high above the ground. One by one, the blocks settled into their assigned spaces. When the last stone locked into position, the pyramid's shape was complete. No further courses needed to be added. What remained was finishing work, polishing surfaces, clearing construction debris, and preparing surrounding structures associated with the royal burial complex. Priests and officials likely conducted ceremonies marking this achievement. Offerings were presented,
prayers recited, and sacred rituals performed to consecrate the monument. The pyramid transformed from a construction project into a spiritual gateway intended to serve the king in eternity. For the laborers who had dedicated years of their lives to this effort, the moment carried quiet significance. Their daily routine of hauling, cutting, measuring, and lifting had culminated in a structure unlike anything else on Earth. After the ceremonies ended and the workforce gradually dispersed, the plateau entered a different phase of existence. Without thousands of workers arriving each morning, the once busy settlement slowly emptied. Wind moved freely through streets where voices had once echoed. Storage yards that had held mountains of stone now stood nearly bare. Bakeries that once produced endless loaves of bread cooled into silence. The pyramid remained exactly where it had been placed, rising sharply against the desert sky. Yet the people responsible for its existence were already beginning new chapters elsewhere, returning to villages, joining other construction crews, or simply continuing ordinary lives along the Nile. Centuries later, travelers would stand before that monument and wonder how such an immense structure came into being. They might imagine supernatural forces or forgotten technologies, but beneath the surface of speculation lies a simpler truth. The pyramid exists because thousands of individuals committed their time, strength, and skill to a shared undertaking. Farmers, artisans, cooks, engineers, and scribes all contributed pieces of a puzzle that eventually formed a geometric giant of stone. Their footsteps vanished long ago, erased by wind and time. Yet the pyramid continues to stand, quietly carrying the memory of human effort embedded within every block. And somewhere in the desert night, when the wind brushes against those ancient stones, it passes across the silent record of countless hands that once shaped them.